Welcome to KWargs, the killer Ruby feature you're not using, or almost certainly not really using. Unless it's led you to significantly change the way you're writing Ruby code, you're probably not getting nearly everything out of this feature. So by the end of this presentation, I hope to have changed that for you. I am Guy Howe. I have been a software developer for 20 years. A Ruby developer for 10 years. I taught at a boot camp for a particularly popular Ruby web framework. The developers of this conference have made it clear to the presenters here that we're not allowed to discuss this certain popular Ruby web framework. Apparently it has its own conference, so therefore we're not allowed to talk about it in any way here. So I taught at a boot camp for a year for that. I'm currently a senior developer at the marvelous company Airspace Technologies. This is how you can get in touch with me. In the course of this presentation, I intend to discuss what KWargs do, and then how using them effectively can make your code clearer, more flexible, and more functional. I think you come to a conference like RubyConf hoping you will go home with some things to think about, some things that will hopefully make you better Ruby developers. And I'll have done a pretty poor job by the end of this presentation if I haven't given you a couple of fundamental things about Ruby to think about and experiment with. So we begin with making it clear what KWargs is, how it works, what it does. Here is an example of a Ruby function declaration and all of the possible ways of providing or declaring the arguments to that function. So we can have a required positional argument, an optional positional argument, a positional arguments splat, a required keyword argument, an optional keyword argument, and a keyword argument splat, and you can have a block. The keyword arg splat, it turns out, is super interesting, and I'll get to that in a bit. The Ruby developers have done a bang-up job of making using keyword args pretty intuitive. Now, nothing I'm going to be showing here technically you couldn't do in Ruby 1.8. It's just an awful lot easier now. And they've made it back pretty much 100% backwards compatible. So you can write a function like that. You can also use a keyword args function like this, just supplying a hash instead of the arguments. That's what lets you write a call to a keyword args function in the really old style. And what's nice is you can go through your code that you've inherited from 10 years ago and update the functions as you go to use keyword args, and the clients of them that are perhaps written in this old style will all still just continue to work just fine. This is quite nice too. Notice that any of the keyword arguments can have as their default values any expression that refers to any of the arguments before them. So that works out quite nicely. You can't have circular references, but you've got a good deal of flexibility about making defaults depend on the other arguments. A couple of caveats. They're really necessary complexity that I don't think there was any way around these. You have to write the positional arguments before the keyword arguments. So positional argument, positional argument, positional argument, positional argument, splat, keyword argument, keyword argument, keyword argument, keyword splat. If particularly the last positional argument that you're providing has a hash value, the mechanism that interpolates the hash can get confused and think you're trying to interpolate those values as separate keyword arguments rather than providing a hash value, so don't do that. Now, I'm going to explain how we can make our code clearer using KWargs. Now, this may seem either obvious if you haven't experimented with it, or if you have experimented with it, your feeling at this point may be it's sort of clearer, but there are downsides. So I'm going to provide what I hope is a pretty comprehensive answer to how we can use keyword arguments in a way that makes our code unambiguously clearer. Here is a call to a standard library function that allows us to access HTTP services. Unless you've used this function recently, or you have the documentation open in front of you, I defy anyone to tell me what all of the arguments of this function are. Just so it's clear, they are the name of the HTTP server or its address, the port on which you want to access it, the proxy server name or address, the proxy server port, and then the last two arguments are, any guesses? No, they're not. They're the proxy server username and password, and this, frankly, is rubbish. Ruby is a programming language that is very much emphasizing clarity of expression, ease of expression, and this, frankly, is rubbish. We can do better. So let's imagine a world in which the Ruby standard library was rewritten to use KWargs. So I might be able to do the last call in this case like this. And it is true that with this, you don't need to break out the documentation to know what all the arguments are. But particularly if you've tried to experiment with using KWargs in the past, you're not going to be particularly happy with this. And fair enough. It is in a sense clearer, but really you look at a block of code like that and you just go, ugh. I mean, it's just ASCII salad, right? It's horrible to try and read. We can do better. But in order to do better, we are going to have to give up a cherished communal, cultural practice. And it's one we get from this book. Now, I'm a big admirer of this book. If you are going to write any sort of complex technical manual and make it readable and interesting, you could do a lot better than making it as much as possible like this book. It's amazingly well written, and it was more or less single-handedly, it and its authors were more or less single-handedly responsible for moving Ruby out of a niche language in Japan onto the world stage. I don't think we would all be here tonight if it wasn't for this book. Not only did it do that for us, but it also established most of the main conventions that we pretty much all use. I can go to somebody else's Ruby code, and if they've been around in the Ruby community for a while, their code's going to look a lot like my code. And the reason is that we all made our code look like the code in this book, the way we write blocks, all sorts of things. Conventions about the way our code looks. But there is a convention from this book that I'm afraid we're going to have to ditch if we're going to make effective use of KWargs. That practice is the way we write method calls. Rather than writing them in a single line as we have done, we should now write them like this, at least if you're going to use KWargs. Now, this is clearer. I defy anyone to tell me that the bottom one is in any way, other than shorter, better than the top one. Now, I've been going around since I started experimenting with KWargs and seeing these new possibilities for how we can make our code clearer, and some of the other things that I'm going to show you in a while that also give you strictly new ways of expressing and structuring your code. I've started saying to people, we should really change the way we're writing our code. We should make it look like this is this. And I show them a method written like this, and they go, oh, no, don't. I like my buggy whip. I can understand why this much, if I show you this much, you might say, it's a bit clearer, but I'm pretty comfortable with the way I'm working. I don't really see the advantages as being sufficiently compelling for me to break with the way everybody else is writing code. New developers are going to be uncomfortable with it. I'm not really sure this is sufficiently better for me to pick it up. I like my buggy whips. And fair enough. Fair enough. So let's go on now to show that not only can we make our code clearer, but KWargs can also make our code more flexible. There is one particularly important feature of KWargs that enables this. Well, actually two. The double splat at the end is the second one. But let's just look at this one because this is the one that's simple and obvious and gives us a clear way of improving our code. And it is this. Optional keyword arguments are actually fully optional. Optional positional arguments are only a bit optional. If you have 4 optional positional arguments at the end of your function, you can only provide them left to right. I can't just provide the third one. If I want to provide a value, an override for the third value, I also must supply a value for the first and second one. But if I'm using KWargs, the name rather than the position is how I pick them out, so I can supply whichever ones I want. This single, seemingly not enormous or momentous difference really enables us to make new and better uses of Ruby, particularly as a functional programming language. So this call, I can drop the port. If I want, I can supply server port and proxy user, right? I can choose which values I want to supply and go with the defaults for the others. So let's see how this might work. I'm working along, I've written myself a nice function, has a required argument, an optional argument, and I have a place where I'm calling it. And now I want to use it somewhere else, but it needs to be a bit more flexible, right? So I can add a new option that allows me to, exercise that new flexibility, and I can call that and supply an override for that argument in some new place, and I have to change the existing function. I can do it again, supply a different one of my defaults, and again, I don't have to change anything. Now, you can't do this with positional arguments. Not with this flexibility. Not really. You'll wind up having to either write multiple functions, or probably what you will do is switch to a more verbose, object-oriented style in order to give the callers of your code this sort of level of flexibility. But the functional programming, I think the world is coming to see that more functional, less object-oriented is the way to go. And this allows me to do more with just functions. Sometimes you need the big complex object hierarchy and all the rest of it. But with KWargs, we can do a lot more with just functions. So there's a word for a feature that allows, or code that can be easily changed in one place without having to make changes in too many other places. It's a complex technical term you may have heard of called loose coupling. So KWargs enables a new form of loose coupling in Ruby. But just hang on, we're going to dial this up a bit more soon. So I talked about how the alternative to this more loosely coupled functions is an object-oriented programming style. And as I say, I'm not proposing that we give up object-oriented programming entirely. But imagine you're back in the day, you're working at 37 Signals and they're working on the first version of Rails, and they say to you, we need an ORM. We need something that'll generate SQL for us in multiple different databases. And they say to you, here's Ruby 2.1. So you have KWargs available. So would you do it any different? You could certainly do the original version, elaborate object-oriented version of Active Record, and that would be fine. But if you just want to get the job done quickly and simply, but cleanly, can you imagine how you would implement this? This you could have generating SQL in a few hours with tests, right? You're just going to have a SQL string. Is there a where clause inserted here? Is there an order clause inserted here? Bish bash bosh, put it together. Pretty good. Without keyword args, you couldn't do this effectively just using a function with positional args. You would have to do some kind of elaborate object-oriented thing. And I'm not saying it would take you forever, but I think it would take you longer. It would be more code. It would be harder to follow. It would be harder to write. It would be harder to test. The functional solution to this problem is nice. It's nice to have that available. But there's more. Keyword args facilitate dependency injection. For those who are not familiar with the term, dependency injection means that any of the assumptions one of your functions is depending on should be amenable to being supplied from the outside rather than just being hard-coded into the function. So if I have this sort of somewhat curious formatting function that outputs some HTML, and notice this is written in old style, right? This is a positional args function. And someone comes to me and says, this is great, but now we have a part of the application where we need to be able to supply the font. And you've got 17 different places in your code where you're already using this function. What do? Well, you add a keyword arg with a default value. And then you use that inside your function. The existing callers of this function don't care. They're not going to know. They're all fine. But now any new code or changes that you make have the option of passing in this particular value if they want to. And we can go further. Someone says, well, I'd like to be able to make it a span rather than a block, rather than a div. We can handle that. Someone comes to you and says, aha, your dependency injection's all very well, but I want to be able to change the way the address is formatted. You're supplying the full address. I've got a place where I just want to show the street name. You say, no, that's fine. I can have a lambda as a keyword argument, as an injected dependency. Notice that keyword args are leading me quite naturally to a functional expression of the way this stuff should work. Dependency injection through keyword args allow me to make my code more flexible. So, the last thing is that keyword args allow me to make my code more functional. I'm calling this coolness. Remember this. Remember this. Remember this. Way back at the top of the presentation. Ah, those were good times. I can call a function that takes keyword args like this, as we said. Better way of writing it though, because it's more explicit that you're doing that sort of hash unpacking, is to do it like this with the double splat. So the double splat says unpack this hash as the arguments to this function. You can combine regular keyword args and the hash and the sort of hash injection. The hash wins if you do that. So if I do this, where the hash has a value for width and I've provided an explicit value for width, the function will get, the rect function will get the value 10, not 30. I'm not sure that's the way I would have done it, but it's not a big deal. If you want it to the local override to win, you can do this. Because keyword args turn Ruby into a lean, mean hash a processing machine, and hashes in Ruby are amazing, so it's not a big deal. We can solve it, quite easily. Okay. Let's say I have a controller method in a Ruby web framework, and I've grabbed myself a user, and now I want to calculate their salary. And the salary calculation takes a base and a per mile value, just whatever, something. Now let's say some users, these values are different. Now there's a variety of ways of solving that. But here's a nice simple way. I can add a JSON field, which Ruby will automatically convert into a hash, to user, and I can supply that as my double splat argument. Job done. Super easy. Like I say, there are other ways of solving it, but I don't think there are anything like this simple, obvious, declarative, just plain elegant answers to this sort of problem. And we can go further. Let's say we want to be able to get defaults from the company or the user. Well, that's fine. This is Ruby. Hashes are easy. All right. So I have a function, and I give it a final double splat, and I'm calling it C. I've taken to calling it C. C is for context. Now notice I can call this function foo and supply with any keyword arguments I like. Make up any kind of nonsense I like. I only have to give it an A. And foo will ignore any values I give it that it doesn't know what to do with. That's okay. So what? Well, this enables a whole new style of functional programming in Ruby that I call a context funnel. Context funnel is very simple. To build a context funnel, all you have to do is pass on C. So what does that look like? Well, here's my foo, and inside foo I call bar, and I pass some values into bar, and I just always put C at the end, like that. I might modify C, I might merge it with something. The basic contract, though, is any values I got that I don't understand need to be passed on. Maybe for security reasons, I might want a whitelist. In general, you want to pass everything on. Foo called bar. Bar does the same thing. Bar calls Baz. Baz does the same thing, and it's calling our old friend format address, and it in turn does the same thing. What have I done here? Well, foo is calling bar and passing on C, just calling Baz, passing on C, calling format address. So this C, this values I didn't understand, is just getting passed on all the time. So in the end, without even needing to know what that is, any function that comes after foo gets to see anything that was passed in that I didn't understand. So now I can do this. Right? I can change my format address function, add a new argument to it, and inject it somewhere like 4 calls away. And I have to change anything in between. I don't have to set a global value. I don't have to create some object-oriented state that I have to carry around. This is purely functional. with all of the attendant benefits in being easier to reason about, easier to test. But I have this really interesting property now where I can add value, insert values into a call chain at any point and access them at any point later. I can mix these features together. This is an entirely new kind of loose coupling that I've never seen before. I've been using it. I've only really realized this sort of thing is possible in the last few months, and I've been using it in my work, and it's pretty interesting. If you're trying to nut out a complex problem in particular, I've been doing some things with parsing and generating EDI messages, which are kind of complicated. And as you're sort of writing, parsing this bit and thing, and then I need to generate down here, being able to, access some new value down here and inject it up here and not have to worry about modifying the code in between is really nice. So, keyword args are clearer. Keyword args are more flexible. Keyword args are cool and functional. Keyword args are just better. They let you write better code, more loosely coupled code, more functional code, clearer code. Thank you.